Yo, welcome to The Noob and the Knower. In this podcast, we pair a driven beginner with a seasoned vet to explain how to learn basically anything.
This season's anything is how to fly fish. Stick around as we cover the gamut, 101 to the 401, gear, reading water, fishing techniques, and much, much more.
With star of hit video series Modern Nymphing, Fly Fishing Team USA medalist, and professional guide Lance Egan.
That's right. And here co-hosting and asking the questions on your behalf is avid fly fisher and recently graduated noob Pablo Signori.
So let's go. Together we'll take you from fishing zero
to fly angling hero faster than you can say, fish on.
Okay, the Noob and the Knower podcast, season 1, episode 9. Ladies and gentlemen, and everyone in between, we are here ready to rock. We are talking about a subject that is extremely popular right now, and it's kind of a new technique that's come up in the last few years called Euro-Nymphing. So the last podcast was about nymphing. This time we're going to get a little bit deeper and go into this new style of nymphing and it's not really that new, but it's new to a lot of people. This style of fishing called Euro-Nymphing that's just a total hot button topic in fly fishing right now. And if you're just getting into it, you'll probably hear the word and be like, what is this thing? It's totally out in left field. So we're here actually with Mr. Lance Egan.
Hola.
Yes, sir. And Mr. Ray.
What's up?
Yep. So before we even start talking about this, we're going to talk a little bit about Mr. Lance Egan, Legan, if you will. We got Ray, because if we take your last name and we take off the back end, we got the R and the Blay, Ray. And with you, we got Legan. I thought about that earlier, and I was like, I got to start calling him Legan and Ray.
Legan.
Yeah.
All right.
But anyways, we're going to be talking about Mr. Lance Egan here because he is kind of one of the founders of this style of fishing in the United States. We're going to kind of break that down just a tiny bit just to give you a little bit of backstory on it. Unfortunately, everyone thinks that that's like his thing, and his thing is kind of being like prolific in every style of fly fishing.
I can attest to that. I had somebody come in the shop and ask for materials to tie a corn-fed caddis.
Nice. That's a dry fly.
It's a Legan dry fly.
Yes, sir.
It's a Legan dry fly right there. Well, that's good. So the word's spreading. Maybe someone heard a previous podcast.
Yeah.
Nobody's come in yet to tie a headstand carp fly, though, huh?
No, not yet, although I will advocate for that every day, every night. Just 24/7. Carp.
No, he invented that one. Didn't you invent that one?
Yeah, that's one of my carp patterns.
I forgot about that.
Man. Shame on me for not knowing that.
That's one of those under the radar ones.
That thing's awesome.
That's because it's a carp fly. Nobody talks about those unless you're...
Don't tell Ike about that.
Yeah, exactly. There's this thing called competition fly fishing, which is basically like these tournaments within fly fishing, and they get to a very, very high, hard level, right?
They get to a world championship level, yeah.
Okay, he's got a sign that it's in his little room back there. We're on Zoom also here, and it says World Fly Fishing Championship. I don't know how you would, because every time I see you on Zoom, I'm like, that thing is so sick.
Out of sight, out of mind. That one's very from the New Zealand Championships. I had to pay to ship that thing back here.
Really?
Yeah.
Worth it.
So it was like it's a flag from like their light poles in the city where the championships were held, because they advertised it for like a month ahead of time and up to. So then they sold them off as like a fundraiser as well, and then you could pay, I think it was like $80 for the flag, and then you had to pay to ship it. So I'm into it a little bit, but I really like it. It's a cool little feature of my fishing room.
Yeah, it's so cool. Well, maybe we can do a little screenshot and put it in the show notes.
Nice.
So let's talk about Euro-Nymphing. It came kind of from the competition scene, also known as the comp scene, right? It was that's the way it got popularized in the United States, at least. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's my understanding of it. It, I would say that it originated from Vladi in Poland. He showed up to a world championship and just kind of obliterated everybody. And
what year was that?
I think that was 89, I want to say, something like that. I could be off by a year or two there, but it was in Finland. I remember that, not because I was there, but because I've heard the story. But he just dominated, and he was doing things differently then than we are now. It's evolved quite a bit, but that's where most people would credit it the first kind of competition nymphing style.
Okay.
The rules in the competition don't allow for strike indicators. They don't specifically call it strike indicators. What the rules say is that you can't add anything to the leader that floats or sinks the leader other than flies. So that takes out floating strike indicators. It takes out split shot or sinkers. So you basically had to have weighted flies and figure out a different way to register strikes than a floating indicator.
Okay, so if you guys remember from the last podcast when we were talking about nymphing, you can put like split shot to get your flies down if you need to, and the strike indicator is usually like basically a bobber. So you're not allowed to do any of that stuff in the competition scene. So that's why this technique was sort of developed in a way, right?
Yeah, I think so. It evolved, to my understanding, it evolved to be a way to fish nymphs within the rules of the World Championship competition.
Right. You call it Euro-Nymphing. I was trying to figure this out. Do you know who actually came up with that moniker for the style?
I don't know who came up with that. I certainly didn't come up with it. We being Devin, I, and Gilbert in our modern nymphing video decided to use that term because we felt like it kind of encompassed all, the whole area, the region, because it kind of it started, I would argue, from Vladi in Poland, but the Czechs were very quick to gravitate to it and evolve it to their own needs and fine tune it. The French and the Spaniards and everybody over there was grabbing hold of it and trying to learn a little bit about it and be more competitive, right? And so we just thought, rather than call it Czech nymphing or call it, that if you want to make Vladi's blood boil, you call it Czech nymphing because he's Polish. And
Czech nymphing.
Right.
I think most people would argue he started it. But since we weren't showing in our videos exactly Vladi's style, we weren't showing exactly what we had learned from other guides we'd had over there, it was more something that we'd put together, a conglomeration, if you will, of techniques. So we just called it Euro-Nymphing. Again, I'm sure we weren't the first ones to use that term. I don't know who coined it.
Okay, so the reason he's referencing his movies is, and we have previously, is because kind of when they made these movies, Lance, Devin Olson, and Gilbert Rowley, they put out this series of movies. It was Modern Nymphing Elevated, and Adaptive Fly Fishing, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so they put out these three movies. It's kind of like a 101, a 201, and a 301. And they kind of just changed the game because it was like the first time, aside from books, that you could actually like see how this thing was done and kind of it was explained the entire setups. Previous to that, there was like George Daniel's book. It was basically Euro-Nymphing in his first, right? Dynamic nymphing.
He did a little bit of it all. Dynamic nymphing had indicators and other styles in there, but yeah, he certainly covered lots of aspects of Euro-Nymphing. But at an earlier, as you mentioned, it came out before our videos. George got involved with Team USA just shortly after I did, and so he and I kind of cut our teeth learning from a lot of the same teachers and had a lot of the same influences. By the time our video came out, a lot of the things that George shared in his awesome book Dynamic Nymphing had actually changed a bit. Leaders and things and flies, everything's always evolving, so there's just constantly changing. But yeah, his book was like, I would say, of the U.S. available stuff, the first real, Bible of it, if you will. There were a few books. I have one from the Czech Republic and a few videos from Czechs and other people overseas that tried to explain things, in broken English or in a translated version of a book that gave you little snippets of things to play with.
Okay, fair enough. What you guys did was basically say there's all these styles that are kind of floating around Europe. Mm-hmm. The Spanish, the French, the Czech, the Polish, they're all kind of doing it a certain way, and you put it together into one kind of amalgamation of a style. Is that right?
Yeah, that's pretty right. We were, early on, we were heavily influenced by Vladi because he was one of the coaches of Team USA. He fished a very short leader, heavy fly type of rig, and as the technique evolved, we kept making leaders longer and longer and a little thinner and thinner. And so by the time we had our first video, we kind of shared 2 or 3 different leader styles that were working for us at the time, and we're giving people some options therein. So it's, like I say, it's always evolving, but yes, it was put together from what we knew at the time and tried to share what we'd learned over at that time, like a I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 years of competition experience, somewhere in there.
Okay, great. So hopefully if you're totally new to all this, like this might be a lot of information about the backstory of Euro-Nymphing, but it's kind of important to get out there just because it doesn't really get talked about that much. A lot of times people are just like, it's a European style of fishing, but there's a whole story about how this evolved, and it happened so recently that it's actually pretty interesting and important to know about, which is why we're bringing it up before we even get into how you do it and what it really is and what makes it so different. One of the things I wanted to ask you was, why do you think it's become like so wildly popular? I mean, you guys were responsible with your movies, and we keep talking about the movies not just because Lance is our co-host, but for me personally, I had never caught a trout by myself. In fact, I was extremely intimidated by it. I heard about this Euro-Nymphing thing, and I went out and I tried it, and I remember it so well. It was in upstate New York. I don't even know what leader I used. I just kind of heard about how it was sort of done, and I hid behind this boulder, and I just like dropped my fly on the other side of the boulder and let it drift, and I just lifted my fly, and I had a fish on, and I was like, this is incredible. How did I just do that? It was like a magic trick. And from that moment on, I was like, I need to know everything about this. And that's when I got all the videos, and literally they taught me how to catch trout. They became like my fishing Bible. I learned so much from them, and I started following these guys, and that's actually how I went on to do the podcast with Lance, because I'm such a big fan. So if you guys haven't picked up the videos and you want to learn how to Euro-Nymph, I definitely would do that, because it just breaks it down completely. It's kind of like our podcast, except for just Euro-Nymphing.
It's all very visual. Yeah, thanks for that shout out. They're available via DVD or digital download on Vimeo, vimeo.com.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can put the links in the show notes and make sure that people know where they're at. But having said all that, why do you think it's become so popular? Because I think once those videos came out, I mean, that was really where things peaked, I think, maybe. Because it was just, people were kind of like percolating about it, talking about it. It was like a thing that you heard of kind of in like these hush-hush conversations behind fly vices. Right. And then all of a sudden, it was like every article, everything that you see, rod companies, everyone's making something like Eurocentric, right?
Right. Yeah. No, it's changed a lot. You're correct. I've done some magazine work over the years, and the first few articles I ever wrote, the editor was very specific. Do not mention competition fly fishing. It's a hot button. It'll send people off. It's a trigger. We don't want them to talk about it.
Yeah.
Don't even bring it up. And now, like the last fly fisherman, there's a whole bunch of competition techniques and a world champion sharing stuff, and it's totally come full circle. It's pretty funny to watch. But to answer your question, I think it's kind of a perfect storm of lots of things. One, having the availability of the videos and books and things that people have written. George's book, Devin's book, our videos. There are other videos and books out there too. But combine that with fly fishers are really eager to just learn stuff, generally speaking, I find.
Yeah.
People that are really passionate, dedicated anglers at least really like to dig in and learn about these new things and find more ways to catch fish. And that basically segues into the part that I think is most important is, like you found, people that try it just have immediate success.
Right.
And I think it's maybe a little more challenging with the rigging and long leaders and things to cast. And you can't just as easily go and buy a taper leader off the shelf. They're not as readily available as a standard taper leader, let's say, for dry fly fishing or something else. So there's a little more into it. Mm-hmm. But once you kind of get over that hump and you go to the river and you try it as you did, then I find most people come in and they just glow with excitement because they're catching so many more fish. I mean, if I had $10 for every time somebody said, I watched your videos and now my catch rate is quadrupled or doubled or whatever the number they use, I could maybe pay some gas in my tank. Gas is pretty expensive. Anyway, all jokes aside, I think it's very successful, and that makes people really excited about it. There's also people that don't like it at all, right? There are people who are absolutely not going to try it and don't want to try it, and that's totally fine. Everybody gets to choose. Some people don't like catching fish as much as others do, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think, it's the one thing about this for the listeners that don't know anything about it is that it's a super modern way to fish in a way. Like it's been around for a long time at this point, but as fly fishing has progressed, kind of like the sacredness of it has to be like this and it has to be like that is kind of slowly dissolving and like becoming more diluted, and people are becoming more open and more like fun about trying things that maybe they wouldn't have before.
Yeah, carp fishing.
Exactly.
It's Ray. Well, it gets the people that are all foo-foo about like nymphing in general. It gives them something like that in and of itself, it's like such a technical way to go about doing it, like dry fly fishing is. I think there's way more win on that than like I'm gonna float a bobber and just like watch it and see if I get a fish.
Yeah, that's true too. It's true too.
I'm with you, Ray. It's interesting to hear people talk about it. I've had clients that say, I only really like dry fly fishing, but this Euro-Nymphing has piqued my interest. I don't have any interest in fishing indicators and split shot. I don't want, that's like bait fishing to me, they say, but this Euro-Nymphing is interesting. I want to just see what it's like. So they'll hire me and take them out and do it. And on the flip side, I have people that love indicators and split shot, and they're like, I'm not doing any of that Euro stuff. That's a bunch of garbage. I'll never try it. And they kind of turn their nose up at it either way. And it's funny to see both sides of that, and how some people just love it and gravitate to it, and others don't and are almost appalled by it. It's interesting to me to hear people that are appalled by it. They're usually dyed-in-the-wool indicator folks, which I like indicators too. I've used them for years and years. But people that turn their nose at Euro-Nymphing, they say that's not real fly fishing. And I'm like, yeah, okay, I hear that. If you don't want to do it, that's cool. But how do you say it's not real fly fishing if you're willing to like put on a bobber and 5 or 6 split shot and tell me that that's more? Again, I'm not opposed to that at all. I use indicators. But it's funny to me to hear somebody say, I'm willing to put a bobber on and half an ounce of split shot. That's fly fishing, but no bobber and just a couple of tungsten beads. That's not fly fishing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think people get caught up in
it's a crazy take.
People get caught up in the casting aspect because people love casting a fly line, and it's true. It is very satisfying. There's a certain feel to it. There's like a certain like cadence and a certain tempo.
100%.
And casting Euro, when you learn to actually do it, is actually super fun, and you can get enjoyment out of it. But it's not the same feel for sure. I don't think, at least for me.
No, I'm with you, but I don't think it is with anytime you have a strike indicator and split shot on there. It's not like throwing a dry fly is totally different feel to me than any nymphing setup.
That's true.
But for that, but then again, you have the same guys and gals that will say, I only fish streamers, and you're like, yeah, because throwing those 600, 450 grain sinking head with a giant articulated streamer that you have to duck. Yeah, that's that's a lot more graceful than throwing a little size 20 tungsten nymph. I love all of them. I have 450 grain lines. I love sink tips. I'm not saying you shouldn't do one. I just think it's funny where people draw the line sometimes.
Right.
It's an interesting thing that we have in fly fishing where there's like these boundaries people build for themselves and dig holes, I find, where it's funny to see some people dig a giant hole and then like 5 years later go, maybe I will try that. That's actually okay. I actually kind of like this. This is pretty cool.
Well, once it gets to Fly Fishing Magazine and there's a bunch of articles about it, that's when they start being like, oh, maybe I should try this.
Yeah.
It's probably the wrong place to say it, but I cracked and I bought a Euro rod this year because I was like, man, I'm tired. I want to do it because it's like, I'm that streamer junkie. I'm no.
Yeah.
Big stuff. But it's like, all right, cool. This is like, it brought the fun back into throwing a nymph, and I don't just have to watch a bobber and roll cast.
Yeah, exactly.
It's cool.
I'm with you. I think it's cool, and like I say, I don't think there's no reason to not be a streamer junkie, right? Streamers are way fun. I'm a proponent of just learning all those techniques, regardless.
Right.
They're all fun. They all have their time and place, and if you know how to do all of them, you can use them in the best in each situation to make for the best fishing.
To be well-rounded.
Yes.
Well-rounded. Nice.
So for the people that don't know much about this, you're kind of getting a sense for where this fits culturally in the world of fly fishing, because it is one of these topics where it's like there's people people are really either into it or not. And that same goes with the competition fly fishing, because a lot of people think of fly fishing as like this escape from reality where you go connect with nature, and the fact of bringing like competition into that is just the most like taboo thing you could do. I don't think that, and on this podcast, I mean, we all are like-minded in the fact that we are cool with Euro-Nymphing, obviously. And I think whatever
I don't like it.
Yeah, you hate it. Not only that, but I think we all like what pushes the sport forward and makes people catch more fish and gets people like thinking outside of the box, because that's how the sport evolves. Every sport's like this. It's no different, than anything else.
Yeah.
As time goes on, people get clever and they figure new ways to do things, and it's cool to be part of it. So
all valid points. I think you've kind of picked up when I'm putting down I've pleaded my case as far as I don't understand why people don't like it. I understand people don't want to do everything, but to your point there, I can understand why people don't like competition. People are not interested in competing in fly fishing. I totally get that. It's not for everyone.
Right.
However, it's interesting again to hear, if I'm going to go another soapbox here, but it's interesting to hear people that tell me that fly fishing competition it ruins fly fishing and it does this and does that. And I'm going, but okay, I hear you, but again, nobody's forcing you to do it. So if you don't want to do it, don't do it. That's as simple as that.
Yeah.
But I would argue, just like you just brought up, Pablo, I think it's interesting to see how, if you bring up ski racing, I live in Utah, there's tons of skiers and snowboarders here, right? Almost all of my neighbors are big time skiers. None of them are ski racers. None of them are competitive skiers, but they love to ski.
Yeah.
So does ski racing ruin skiing for everybody? I don't think so. What it does is it makes for better gear. It makes the skis better. People get better understanding, because when you have somebody that's trying to be cutting edge and trying to up their game, if you will, it trickles down, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense for sure.
Very well put.
There's money behind it. That's the other thing, is the people start spending money on it.
There is. In competition fly fishing, there's no money. Nobody wins any
I'm saying like research and design.
No, I know what you mean, but there is. Yeah, the companies are gonna sell stuff, right? Yeah. I just want to make sure that nobody thinks like you're getting. I complained about an $80 world championship thing. I am not rich, trust me.
They made you pay to send that thing back from New Zealand.
I know. What a bunch of jerks.
That's nuts, dude. Freaking.
Anyway,
this guy's meddled and they made him pay for it.
I didn't meddle there. Anyway, it's just funny stuff. So there's competition fly fishing, again, not for everyone, but the trickle down effect of information sharing and techniques and flies and cool stuff that comes from it that's the neat part about it. And honestly, from having been in competition fishing for a long time now, I can tell you that's what keeps most people in it, is learning, sharing information, being on the cutting edge of techniques, and that kind of stuff is really fun, and it trickles down to your own fishing. To me, people come up to me and say, would you really like competition fishing? And I'm like, you know what, sometimes in the middle of a competition when it's not going so well, I don't love it so much. You're either getting your butt kicked, or you're on a particular river that you just haven't grabbed a hold of and don't understand what's going on, or you're on a lake and you're getting blanked, cannot catching any fish. It's not always the most fun, but at the end of the day, at the end of each competition, you've come away with new techniques and you've learned a bunch. You've shared information. You're spending a lot of time with like-minded anglers, and it's a really fun experience. A lot of camaraderie in there. It's not really, there's no money involved, so it's not cutthroat. Nobody's trying to hold out on another team or anything. It's competitive, but it's not cutthroat competitive, if that makes sense.
You're not like doing like what Shaun White does. You don't have like some high alpine lake and river that you like helicopter into just so you can train all the time.
I wish. If I wasn't complaining about $80 banners, I could probably afford a helicopter.
Yeah, right? That's awesome. All right, so let's actually get into what Euro-Nymphing actually is, kind of in practice and in gear. It's become wildly popular, obviously, and we've been talking about this, but it's become wildly popular because it's so freaking deadly, and you just catch a lot more fish using this technique, which is why I fell in love with it, because I was like, man, I went from nothing to actually like catching a bunch of fish. So maybe you can kind of talk to us about what makes it so much more deadly than other nymphing techniques.
Okay, yeah, so it uses longer rods, lighter rods, uses longer leader, weighted flies. So I think some of the things that make it more deadly is that you're in contact with the flies, you're in contact with the weight, because the weight is the flies, rather than with an indicator rig, you're in contact with your sinkers, your weights, no matter where you put them on. So because in your Euro setup, the flies are the weights, you have increased strike detection. You have very little slack. With an indicator rig, you're mending and repositioning line and adding slack to the system to achieve the best drift possible, right? When you add that slack, when you go to set the hook, you have to also remove that slack. So Euro-Nymphing you're very, very tight most of the time. You have a little sag in the leader, but overall you're very tight to those flies. Okay. So you have really good strike detection. The other one that I think is really important is you have decreased influence by the vertical current. So in a river, and we cover this in our videos a lot, our modern nymphing videos, in a river you have slow water near the river bottom and faster water nearer to the surface of the river. So anything that's tethered to the surface, like a floating strike indicator, will be towing flies at surface speed. Okay. So the way to slow it down is to try and add weight that grabs bottom and ticks along. And that's very effective in a lot of cases, but it's not necessarily the best dead drift you can get. And then the way a lot of people rig, they have a thick leader butt that's extending through part of that upper water column too, which is also going to be pulling the rig downstream faster than the slow water near the river bottom. So with Euro-Nymphing, we have nothing but very thin thin tippet. Most Euro-Nymphing's done with like 5X or thinner tippets, occasionally 4X, and just the weighted flies. So you have the weighted flies near the bottom and nothing but very thin tippet extending through the water column, therefore lessening the influence of those vertical currents that are moving faster higher up in the water column, and having nothing floating on the surface that's tethering you to the surface, towing the rig at surface speed. So I think those things kind of all go into come together, I guess I should say, to make it a bit more effective. On the flip side, it has a disadvantage, and that is you have to fish it relatively close. You could fish an indicator rig a lot farther away than you can a Euro rig.
Right. Yeah, and I think you mentioned that a lot of these things are in your videos, and they're explained very well, but one of the big takeaways when I first started getting into it was actually the difference between the speed of the water at the surface and at the substrate at the bottom of the river, because there's, as you guys so well put it in the videos, because there's a bunch of like little rocks and debris and all those things cause friction against the water that's going down the river. It actually makes the water down there slower than the water up top that doesn't have anything to disturb it, to stop it. But the thing is, the fish are hanging out, not always, but a lot of the time they're down near the bottom, and so you're trying to get your flies to drift down there without looking like they're unnatural, they're tied to some line.
Right.
What happens with the strike indicator, or the bobber rig, if you will, is that water up top is moving at its own speed, and the bobber's moving at that speed, and the flies are then moving at that speed. So it's a whole game of like trying to balance how much split shot you can put on this thing to slow it down so it hits the bottom and kind of slows it a bit, but doesn't hang up, which it does all the time. And the difference with the Euro rig is that you don't have to worry about any of that stuff, because you just have one thing that's going straight through the water. Nothing's touching the surface. You're actually holding your rod up high off the water. So you can just keep your rod hand up high, and you just kind of track that line from rod tip all the way down to the beads, and you watch that. And the beads are floating current that's fit a lot slower next to the substrate.
Those beadhead nymphs.
So it makes it a lot more deadly. Yeah, we call them beads. That's a cool kid word right there.
Cool kid alert.
Yeah, I'm tossing beads, bro.
So, and you reminded me of another thing that's really, I think, an advantage to Euro-Nymphing, and that is because you're having everything in the air, you're holding your arm high oftentimes with a long rod and a long leader system with nothing touching the water except flies and tippet. You eliminate the need to mend and reposition the line as much. So when you're in really conflicting currents like pocket water, for instance, as long as you can wade within 20 to 30, 35 feet of where you're trying to fish, you throw with the Euro rig, you throw in there and you just high stick the whole thing to where you don't have to compensate for all those conflicting currents. You're just holding all that line and leader up off the water, and you're able to fish the exact speed of current that your flies land in, rather than have them being influenced by all those conflicting currents between your position standing wise and where you're trying to fish.
This is Pisces Varies, an NATK segment where I, Jen Ripple, define fishy words for you. Boom! High sticking, verb, fly fishing jargon. Holding your rod high and at an angle so as to prevent as much fly line and tippet from touching the water while still keeping your dry fly, nymph, or streamer fishing. Example in context. Oh, Wayne Gretzky was penalized for Euro-Nymphing.
I gotta ask a question. So, for me, coming from the bobber and split shot thing, and then going to basically nothing but leader and nymph, I perceive an extra bit of stealth in this. And is there truth to that, or am I just making things up?
No, I think that's very valid. I mean,
he obviously didn't watch the videos.
Anytime you can cut. Yeah, watch the videos. I think it's very effective. I think you're right though, Ray. I think if you have, you're limiting, instead of having an indicator, well, so let's start at the back end. Having fly line hit the water, a strike indicator hit the water, split shot hit the water, and the little plop of flies, we're eliminating most of that and only having the plop of a fly or two or three flies, depending on what local laws allow, right? Most of the time with two flies. So you have simply two little tungsten bead heads that hit the water, and that is it. So I think it's much more stealthy, than an indicator rig in most situations.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I did want to say something backtracking to what you were talking about. So when I first started fishing for trout, I started basically on Euro. And so later I had to learn how to do dry fly fishing. And one of the things that I didn't realize, which is kind of what Lance was just talking about before we were talking about the stealth factor, was that when you fish a dry fly or a strike indicator setup, what ends up happening is a lot of times you'll have a piece of water that's flowing at a certain pace, and you're standing 15, 20, 25, 30 feet from that thing, and then the water between you and the water that you're trying to fish is moving at a different pace. Mm-hmm. So when you cast your fly line across that water and you land your fly in the water that you're trying to fish, what ends up happening is all this water starts pulling on your fly line on the in-between water.
What a drag.
It pulls, it's that thing that we keep talking about, which is the drag. It ends up moving your flies in an unnatural way. The beauty of Euro-Nymphing is that you don't have to deal with any of that at all. You just hold your hand up and you're avoiding all those cross currents that normally would be a serious issue as far as getting a drag-free drift. So what Lance was saying with holding your arm up high, that's kind of like the standard position when you're fishing Euro-Nymphs. You hold your hand up high and you're actually holding your line off the water, avoiding all those in-between currents. So you can't fish very far away, but you can avoid the current that's not the same as the water that you're trying to fish. Sometimes the water's the same, but sometimes it's not. And it's a really, really easy way to get your flies to go where they want to go and not be inhibited by drag.
And for those that haven't tried it, you brought up another thing, Pablo, that's worth mentioning, and that is the gear to Euro-Nymph. You use a much thinner fly line, a much longer leader that's usually thinner than a regular leader, and a much longer rod. All those combined just make it so that you can fish a lot farther away. So we get people in the shop all the time. They're like, can I just try Euro-Nymphing with my 9'5" weight? And you're like, yeah, absolutely can. You can't do it very well, because you've got a line that has way too much mass. It's going to sag way too much. Your rod's too short and too stout. Can you try it? Absolutely. But it's when you get the right Euro setup, it allows you to fish a lot farther away and allows you to avoid all those conflicting currents by the tackle kind of enables you to do that.
Just to piggyback on what he just said, you totally can fish. I actually Euro-Nymphed with an 8 weight and caught fish two times now. Just weird situation, and it was totally fine. 9 foot 8 weight, and I caught fish that were probably 9 to 12 inches long. So it's totally doable.
Yeah.
I have stories of carp exploits with tight lining rods and all that stuff.
Yeah, it's just it's not ideal, but you can make it work. It's just once you fish with a rod that's actually made for it, though, you realize why you do that.
In the shop, we often say, can you swing a driver really slowly on the green and try and putt it in with the driver? You could. Would you choose to use the driver on the putting green? No, I'm not a golfer. But you know what I mean. You're not. It's not the right tool. Can you make it work? You absolutely can make it work.
I can read between the lines.
You won't see anybody that knows what they're doing on the golf course doing that, but you could try it.
Game over.
Dang, that was hard.
Ow, that hurts.
I was there steelheading, okay, and I let my buddy go take the spot.
Sometimes you just gotta improvise.
And I was like, all right, well, if he's gonna take the spot, then I'm gonna go over here and fish for little dinks. So I switched out my leader, put a Euro leader on my 8 weight, and it worked.
Made it work. In a pinch, it's to catch fish is better than not to catch fish. Might as well.
Exactly. All right, so you kind of started going down that route, and I think that now is probably a good time to do it. Why don't we start talking about the setup with this Euro thing? And like we've done in previous podcasts, I want to start from the fly all the way back. So we're going to start from the very front because, for one, the Euro nymphs, these flies that are nymphs, they're kind of interesting and different in many ways from, maybe not totally different from regular nymphs, and you can definitely Euro nymph with classic old patterns of nymphs, but there's been some cool ones and some innovation that's happened in the recent years, or maybe not super recent, but there are some actual style specific flies that we can kind of get into. So what are we looking for if we're looking for a Euro fly? What kind of makes it a good Euro pattern?
In a nutshell, most Euro nymphs are tungsten beaded, right? They need to have some weight. You could also add some lead wire, lead-free wire underneath the body to give even more weight. But it seems like the evolution of Euro nymphs is getting more and more away from the wire and more towards just tungsten beads that are larger sized. So because the flies in Euro-Nymphing are your weights, the most important thing fly-wise in Euro-Nymphing, in my opinion, is having a variety of weights. That doesn't necessarily mean a variety of sizes of flies. It's really more a variety of densities, because you could have a size 12 fly that has a 4mm bead but also has legs and a big fuzzy body that would sink slower than a size 16 fly with like a 3mm bead with no appendages on it, just a, like a Perdigon style. If you're not sure what that is, Google it, but you'll see a really slick kind of UV resin style fly that might actually sink faster than a bigger fly. So big doesn't equate to heavy. In other words, you just need to have, because you're not adding split shot to adapt your weight, you need to have flies in various weights to accommodate different depths and speeds of water.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Perdigon, which has kind of like become sort of the poster child for the Euro-Nymph fly. And one of its main characteristics is kind of this it's a resin body, so it's this kind of shiny, plasticky body that just slips through the water. And Perdigon is actually a BB in Spanish, so it's meant to sink like a BB.
Like a pellet.
Exactly. And I had a cool story about the origins of the Perdigon, but Lance was different, so I don't know if we're even going to bring him up this time, because that's something I need to talk to him about off the podcast and figure out whose story actually makes sense, or if either do.
I don't think we can talk about it and figure it out. We'd have to talk to the Spaniards, right?
But it's a nymph that came from Spain, that has now become very, very popular. And people are actually just there. I'm sure people are using it just to fish regular strike.
Oh yeah, we sell lots of them just for like drying a dropper, for instance.
What's cool too about the Perdigon is you can take classic patterns and make them Perdigon style. You just kind of add up the same colors and sort of like the same look, and make sure that you tie it super small and cover it in shellac, and you're good to go. It's not actually shellac.
We should bring up that Perdigon is a style of fly, not because people will go online and start looking for a Perdigon, and like the fly pattern that's called Perdigon, and it is a style fly. There are millions of color combos and bead colors and sizes and on and on. But yeah, to your point, you can make them in all kinds of cool, sizes, colors, shapes, all kinds of stuff.
All right, well, let's talk about a couple more. Lance actually has some really cool patterns that he's developed himself, because he is actually a commercial fly tyer. One of them he told me to fish not too long ago, and I had seen it for a number of years and I'd never tried it out, called the Tungsten Surveyor. I've taken it out 2 times now and I've had great success with it. Highly recommend the fly. And it's funny because that's a fly that's originally, you made that for like tailwaters and spring creeks, because it's like kind of a scud style fly, but it fishes like everywhere, right?
Yeah, it fishes as kind of an attractor. I guess I would tell the story of the Surveyor. To me, when I made it, I was starting to toy more with hot spots and things like that in flies. The Rainbow Warrior is my first commercially available fly, and it has a red hot spot behind the bead.
Very famous.
And so my other real confidence fly at the time of the Rainbow Warrior was just a standard old hare's ear. But I tied a lot of my hare's ears. I started tying them with red thread as well. I liked hare's ears a lot. I caught a lot of fish on hare's ears, but I was also really intrigued by the Rainbow South Scud dubbing that Wapsie put out that I used on the Rainbow Warrior. Yeah. And I thought, why not combine, like the Rainbow Warrior catches fish, hare's ears catch fish. Why not tie a hare's ear basically out of rainbow dubbing, if that makes sense?
That's cool.
So that was the original Surveyor, and then I started messing with tail materials and wire colors and bead colors and so on to where it is now. But yeah, that the Surveyor is a great one. I have lots of other patterns that we don't need to necessarily mention all of them, but if you were bored one day and you wanted to Google up my flies, you could just search Lance Egan fly patterns or something like that, and
there's a lot of gems.
Frenchies or thread Frenchies, or the Surveyor I used a lot on tailwaters locally. I think the fish here eat it mostly as a sow bug, but I've also tied it in really small sizes in tailwaters in other states and caught them where they feed on mysis.
That's a shrimp.
Back east. Yep, back east I've used them a lot, where a lot of the eastern streams, rather than sow bugs, they seem to call them crest bugs. I think they're basically the same thing, but they work really well there. And then it also works in places where there are none of those, where it's just an attractor pattern. It's very translucent, has a little red on it. Fish seem to like red, who knows why, and it's a very effective pattern.
All right, cool. Yeah, I love it now. I've tied it in a bunch of different sizes, and it's taken up a big part of my nymph box, so I've been having good success with it. Some of the other things I was going to mention was that there's these kind of like what they call trash flies that have become sort of popular in like the Euro sort of world. You know, you have the squirmy wormy, the mop fly, Pat's rubber leg.
Like,
I don't know if I'm missing any.
Well, man, the rubber leg was like, that's even like just more of a classic Western, like just big stones.
It has a different name, doesn't it? Like it's like a turd or something.
Yeah, some people call it a turd. Some people call it a Pat Stone.
What?
There's lots of nicknames for that one. Yeah, I don't.
Is it like a girdle bug or something? There's
girdle bug's similar. It's got rubber legs. Yeah, a little different than a Pat Stone, but it is very similar. Yeah, you certainly hear those flies called junk flies or Euro, like trash flies. I'm not sure how that comes about. I don't know who decides that kind of stuff, but
yeah.
I always tease people that if people will come in and say, I won't, you'll say that, hey, worm imitations are working on the river right now because the river's high and that's what the fish are eating. And they're like, oh, I don't fish worms. And you're like, well, okay. They'll say, what else is working? You're like, oh, sow bugs are working. Oh, I like sow bugs. And to me, I go, okay, there's aquatic worms and there's aquatic, bugs like sow bugs that are crustaceans. They both live in the river all the time.
Right.
Fish eat them both all the time. So why is a worm off limits and a little crustacean's totally fine? I don't know. I don't understand that.
I don't get that either.
Same with eggs. Like people won't fish egg patterns because they, who knows why? It's what trout are eating. If that's what fish are eating, is that not what we want to imitate? I don't understand any of that stuff. The mob fly is a real mystery to me because it's just like, I think the name is what bothers people for some reason, but it could be a crane fly larva, it could be a big caddis, it could be a little minnow. Who knows what the fish eat it as? But people lose their mind over, well, that's not a real fly, and you're like, but what is a real fly? Like
a stimulator.
So let's use that one. I like that. A stimulator's a real fly, right?
Exactly.
So here's the thing. A mop uses some synthetic material for the back end and oftentimes a natural material like a dubbing for the head of it, right?
Right.
A stimulator, people say, well, that's a classic fly. It is a classic fly, but why is it different? It uses synthetic dubbing, uses a hook that's synthetic, it uses nylon thread that's synthetic. The only parts that are natural on are the hackle and the deer hair. And people are like, yeah, but those are natural materials. I'm like, no. They are natural materials, but trust me, God did not put chickens on earth and then say, let there be chickens for fly tying. And let there be elk on earth for elk hair, caddis, and stimulators. That did not happen.
But it's a dry fly.
I've studied the Bible. It did not happen.
And the other thing to that point is that it's also not imitating anything in particular.
A stimulator. Or a royal wolf, or a prince nymph, and on, or a copper john. All of those, I can't. For the life of me, I can't understand why a mob fly is a trash fly. And I have nothing against a copper john or prince nymph, but why aren't those trash flies? Like what? What's different about them?
Well,
they don't
copper
imitate
john
anything.
is a trash fly to me because that thing's so tacky to me now. I don't know why. I see it that way.
Pablo,
I don't know if it still is. It might still be.
I catch fish, but.
At one time, it was the most popular selling fly on planet Earth, the copper john.
I know. And I like being ahead of the trend here. I see that copper john, and it's just like the most taboo thing you could do to me. I'm trying to think of it's like
next thing you do is hand him a squirmy worm.
Yeah, there you go.
I've had this chat with lots of people, and I've used the copper john as another example. Like copper john has copper wire on it, or red wire if you're tying a red one. It has resin. It has thin skin that's a plastic. Like the only thing that's natural on it again is biots that are from a goose and peacock curl from a peacock. So why that's not taboo and a mop is, I throw my hands in the air for those of you who can't see us on Zoom, which is everybody except for Ray and Pablo. I don't understand that. Those arguments are moot to me. I don't like anybody that tells me that a fly is trash because of this or that. I go, okay, you're nuts. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. At least not to me, But so you're gonna start noticing that the Euro thing, there's some haters out there.
There's haters.
It's like anything that kind of makes a wave in any industry. It's like there's people that do not want to let go. It's hard for them to get their head around it, and it goes, all the way from the setup, starting with the fly. So you'll see as we go on. There's other things that people have issues with. But so let's keep moving with it. Actually, so
hold on before we move on. I got one more fun one. You ready?
Okay, go for it.
These are tangents. I know we can cut these out if you need to, but these are fun. So I get after people that won't fish eggs. You ready for this one? So I'll tease people. You won't fish eggs. I'll go, you don't want to fish eggs? That's cool. You get to choose. Have you ever tried streamers? Oh, I love streamer fishing. I'll go, okay, so you'll fish the toddler but not the newborn. Okay, I get it.
I like that.
You got to draw the line somewhere. I don't know. Wherever you want to draw that line. If the fly is going to work and it's a fly and I tied it and I like it, I'm in.
Yeah, that's how I am too. I have no shame. I don't care. It's all fun. If it's catching fish, it's fun.
Fish are eating eggs.
Except
you're going to fish
Copper
eggs.
I don't really care about the Copper John. I just think it's cheesy. That's what it is. It's like it's just out of style now to me. So I'm like, Copper John.
It's not new age enough.
It's too new age.
It's too new age.
It's the Yanni. It's the Yanni of flies.
Copper John's great pattern. I never fish them, but lots of people do.
No, I know they do. I don't actually really care, but actually, it was the first time I fly fished ever. That was the fly that was put on for me was a Copper John. I mean, it's such a classic freaking fly. It's crazy. But anyways, let's keep moving on. So the next thing that comes up, which is also just like a total shift of paradigm within the fly fishing realm with Euro-Nymphing is the leader. Because typically the leaders are super long and they're constructed in a way that you use them actually to indicate when you have a fish that's taken your fly. It's a very subtle thing, and maybe you can talk to us a little bit about kind of how the leaders are made. You don't have to get into necessarily size yet, but maybe just kind of what makes a Euro leader different from like a regular leader for dry fly fishing or anything really.
Yeah, so you could, there's lots of variables there again. We oftentimes start people on a thicker Euro leader that's still a little thinner than a traditional tapered leader, but like in modern nymphing, one of the leaders I shared is more of a beginner leader that goes from 20 to 15 to 12, and it has...
Pounds, you're saying, right?
Yes, thank you for that clarification. It has a little thicker butt section than most Euro leaders, as to someone that's done it for a while would use.
Yeah.
But it has a little bit more predictable delivery, the delivery that someone that's fly fished with a regular tapered leader would be used to. It has, because it's a little heavier, a little thicker diameter, it has a bit more sag that limits how far away from you can fish, and so on. So there's disadvantage, there's gives and takes to all these.
Pisces, varies, boom. Sag, verb. Sag is to sink, subside, or bulge downward under weight or pressure or through lack of strength. Example in context. My fly fishing instructor keeps yelling at me to watch my sag. Silly guy, he thinks I'm in the Screen Actors Guild.
The leader can be super, super thin or a little bit on the thicker side, depending on how you want it to cast, how much control, accuracy-wise you want to have. Just know that you're giving on, when you add thickness to the leader, you're giving on sag and distance, and when you have a super thin leader, you're giving on accuracy and control, but you can fish it farther away with less sag.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about the sag, because I think that word is just like super, super scary when you're Euro-nymphing. The last thing you want is sag. That's kind of like the kiss of death. And you're always going to have some, obviously, but you're trying to eliminate as much as you can as possible. So what's the deal with this sag, and why is it so important when you're trying to get a drift with your flies?
Well, sag pulls your flies towards you, right? So it lessens the distance you can fish away from yourself. It makes it so that you have to fish heavier flies to compensate for the heavier leader. Where a lighter, thinner leader, you can get away with lighter, thinner, lighter flies anyway, less dense flies. Sag is, to describe it, if you're holding your rod up and you're trying to fish, the line and leader extending from your rod tip, they're going to droop because they have a little bit of mass to them, right? So we're creating that little droop in your leader. We're calling that sag. So the heavier your line and leader are, the more it's going to sag, and the thinner, lighter your line and leader are, the less they will sag. So they're again like comparing a tight line, what a lot of Westerners call tight line nymphing, where they're used to using a 9-foot 5-weight or so with some split shot, but their regular fly line, they have a lot of sag because the thick regular fly line has a lot of mass to it. So when you hold your rod up, that fly line will hang almost vertical from the rod tip down, versus a Euro fly line that's super, super thin will have a lot less weight to it, a lot less mass, so it therefore won't sag vertically. It will sag at a much shallower angle and allow you to fish farther away. Same with the leader. The thicker the leader, the more sag. The thinner the leader, less sag.
Right, and you mentioned that it pulls the flies towards you, and also in doing that, it pulls them off the deeper water, pulls them up in the water column, which sometimes is a good thing, but most of the time you want them kind of close to the bottom, at least
for sure
when you're starting, and you could be missing fish.
Because the sag pulls the flies towards you, they're not sinking as fast, is your point. That's a very valid point.
You said it better than I did. Yeah, sag is kind of your arch enemy throughout this whole thing, and a lot of the things that we do in Euro-Nymphing is to combat that. With the rod length is one of them, and then the leader is like a big part of it too. The mass of the leader, the thinner you go on your leader, the classic thing that gets said in the Euro world is thin to win, so that goes for your flies, and that goes for your leader too.
Your fly line,
the thinner, the better. Yeah, the thinner the better, so that it's all to combat sag. I mean, in the case of the flies, it's so that they sink faster, but it's all part of kind of like the same mechanics of what makes this setup work. You kind of touched upon it a little bit, but like if I was just a total noob trying to get into this, 2 questions here. What leader size should I get? And 2, is there one you can recommend that's just like pre-made? I know Devin sells them on Tactical Fly Fishing. Devin is one of Lance's buddies who's on the U.S. fly fishing team. Those work really well too. My brother and my sister use those, but when I don't tie them for them. But I don't know if you have any recommendations that you prefer for beginners.
Yeah, if you don't want to tie your own leader, we sell some from Umpqua, some from Rio. Orvis has them. Almost all the major fly fishing companies, that sell lines and leader materials anyway, have them pre-packaged, ready to go. They're not always our favorite because they oftentimes start with a butt section that's a little thicker than is ideal, but there are some exceptions to that rule. But yeah, generally we like to build our own leaders using mostly Maxima Chameleon or the Cortland Euro-Nymph material or Sunset Amnesia, any of the materials that you can easily release the memory in, because you're going to have a long leader, you don't want it to look like a slinky as you're fishing it, right?
Pisces, berries, boom. Memory, noun. Memory is a fishing term to describe fly line, fishing line, leader, or tippet that has taken on a permanent curl or twist due to extended time spooled on a reel. Example in context. Ugh. I've been driving so long to get to the fishing spot, my backside has memory.
Memory is when your line's been coiled over time, when it's like stowed away and you're not using it, and you pull it out of the package and it's all coiled up. That's called memory, and it's very annoying, especially for this style of fishing, because you're relying on this thing to tell you, you're watching it to tell you when you get a fish, and if there's a bunch of memory, that's basically like air sag,
right?
In a way.
Yeah, whether it's on a spool of tippet or in a package of leader or we're just wound on your reel, it takes a memory, it takes a set, it remembers that shape that it's stored in, right? So it has coiled memory, we call that. So yeah, you just need to be able to release that memory. As far as lengths go, I usually fish a leader that from my Euro fly line down to the cider is in the neighborhood of 12 to 14 feet.
Okay.
And you can play, I'll let people decide how thick or thin they want to get there. I wouldn't go any thicker than anything about 20-pound test on the, if you're doing like Maxima Chameleon, for instance, versus on the super, super light end of things, you could fish like 4X or 5X, which is like 4 thousandths or, 6 thousandths, or, somewhere in there, 4 thousandths, 5 thousandths, 6 thousandths, 7 thousandths of an inch. You're getting really, really thin. 4X is 7 thousandths of an inch.
Yeah.
But some people in competition circles get super thin where they're running like 5 or 6X leader material and then 6 or 7 or 8X tippet. That's hard to cast, hard to control, so most people we recommend starting with something more in the 20, 15, 12 pound category, and when you get used to handling that leader, then start scaling it down. Just keep gradually working smaller and smaller. It's really hard to go from like a 20 or 15 pound leader right to a 4X leader. The casting and everything's really challenging.
In my mind, I see a bird's nest. I see instant tangles because I did that.
Tangles, rod wrapping.
Yeah, that's the big one.
Wraps around the rod tip. You will have very little accuracy when you go really thin. But if you step it down gradually, you'll just compensate for each diameter change, and before long you'll be fishing real thin. Yeah. So you have about, again, 12 to 14 feet from the Euro fly line down to the cider, which terminates at a tippet ring.
Okay, cool. And this is a question that's a little bit more advanced. A lot of times you like to fish streamers, the Euro style streamers. There's also Euro style streamers. They're like smaller streamers. They're very dense. Yeah, they sink faster than a regular one would, maybe, I guess. Mm-hmm. But I was going to ask you do you like switch leaders for that, or you just keep them on the regs?
No, I use the same leader as I do nymphing, just like a regular thin, micro thin type leader.
All right, so that's the leader system. So it ends in a tippet ring, it's a thing that I think got more popular with the Euro setup, but it's actually something you can use on a lot of leaders if you don't want to chew back on your leader after you're changing a lot of flies. You can throw a tippet ring on there, and then you're always just changing to that. It's a good way to save money if you're working that summer job,
if we work back from the flies, that is a good tip. If we work back from the flies, so the fly terminal end, you have a point fly, then you go up usually 20, 24 inches. You have a dropper tag of a triple surgeon's knot to your top fly, right? Or your dropper, sometimes that's called. Again, distance between those two flies is most commonly about 20 to 24 inches.
Right.
Then from your top fly or your dropper to the tippet ring, you'd usually have in the neighborhood. Again, this is ballpark because this is going to vary depending on how deep a water you're fishing and so on. But most of the time, you're going to have about 4 to 6 feet from your tippet ring on your sider down to that first fly, and a couple feet to the second. So you could have anywhere in the neighborhood of like 5 to maybe 8 feet of tippet below the sider. Okay. Again, in really deep water, you might have to change. You have to add that a little more to that. Really shallow, you might shrink that down a bit. Then at the tippet ring, we have our cider, which is the really bright, visible, colored monofilament.
Is it apple flavored or is it?
I think that it's vinegar, apple vinegar cider.
Okay.
That's the kind you like, right?
Nice job.
So the cider is, I need to enunciate, cider.
No, it's funny because my brother actually, I think was it my brother? Someone I know thought it was actually cider.
The cider material.
CIDER, like they just randomly thought it that way, which makes sense.
I've heard that same thing as well.
Yeah.
People always ask me in presentations, spell that. SIGHT.
Yeah, there you go. You got
we'll
it
get there.
Cider.
We'll get there. Cider. I'm from Utah, so I'll
say it like this, you know.
There you go.
Say cider.
No, you're from Oregon, dude. Stop faking.
My bad. I'm not from Oregon. Come on. Anyway, you have the cider, which it's worth mentioning. I like your idea of using a tippet ring to like not cut back your leader. However, I would encourage people to change their cider. It's amazing how much in the shop people come in and they're like, do you guys have a favorite cider you really like? Because I'm having a hard time seeing mine. And you have them bring their spool in, and it's like it's been on there for 3 months.
Yeah.
And there's no color left in it. You're like, have you thought about refreshing it? They're like, I didn't buy any cider. I just put the stuff on that you guys gave me in the shop. They're like, that was like 6 months ago, man. The cider fades. It's just dye, so it fades as you use it. The sun fades it. The water dilutes it. I would change your cider if not every trip, every second or third trip, just to have a really visible cider. It makes a big difference. So change that cider out. But the cider could be anything from like 6 or 8 inches to maybe 2-3 feet if you want. Most of the time I make them in the 15 to 20 inch range lengthwise.
So you're not, because some people use like the entire liter as cider. You don't do that.
Well, I use a lot of times the entire liter that's colored, but I use a different color for the terminal end because that's the part I want to watch is just the terminal end.
I see.
So I like to have a color change there so I know what I'm looking at.
I see.
But yeah, so then you have the cider that's again, 15, maybe 20 inches long, and then the rest of that length from, the 12 to 14 foot length from your Euro fly line to the terminal end of the cider is going to be, 10, 12, 15, whatever pound test you decide to do. And that could be 12 feet, that could be 6, 8 feet on the short end of things, but most of the time that's going to be 10, 12 feet from there, and then adding a little bit of cider, tippet ring, going back down. I'm going back up and down, I realize, but hopefully if we describe this 13 times, people understand what we're saying.
Yeah, and there's a lot of info online about this, and there's a great video of Lance actually on YouTube kind of sussing this all out for everybody, so we can put links to all that also, so you can reference that. The one thing I was going to say is, and this is something I did, and I don't know if you think this is good, so if you don't think it's good, please obviously pipe up. But when I first started, because I was using a regular fly line, and I didn't want that mass coming outside the rod tip and giving me more sag, what I just did was I took a really long piece of Maxima and I kind of would spool that up on my spool. So I would have 20 feet of Maxima and then my cider and everything. So it was like extra long, just so I never had to deal with my regular fly line coming outside my guides. I don't know if you think it's a good idea or not. But
if you're using a regular fly line, I think it's a good idea because that regular fly line is going to sag and fall back in your guides and do all kinds of things, right? That's why we don't use a regular fly line for it. Right. I don't like that personally because I don't like handling monofilament. When I'm casting and then taking up slack, I like to hold fly line. Yeah. So I prefer a Euro fly line. But yeah, if you didn't have a Euro fly line and you're just trying it, then I think that's a good idea just to get rid of that. Don't use your regular fly line at all.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think that's a good tip for beginners. If you already have a fly rod and you already have a setup and you don't want to like invest in a whole another setup and you just want to try it, that's a good workaround. Just make your leader, 12 twice the length of your rod or something like that, and you should be covered.
If you're building your leader, just real quick, if you're making knots in the leader, like let's say you're stepping it down from like 12 to 10 to 8 and then your cider or something like that, I would suggest using blood knots there and then making sure that you trim the tags on the bloods totally flush. So they need to be good, smooth, all the way cinched up blood knots, and then don't leave little tag ends sticking out because they'll just hang up in your guides. And then the last tip is when you connect the super thin Euro line to your leader, make sure that connection is super, super smooth too. You don't want a loop-to-loop connection. You want a really seamless connection there. It needs to go in and out of the guides effortlessly, right?
Right. That's one of the things I have in my notes here. Leader to fly connection, question mark, loop, splice, micro loop. So basically it was just like, what should you do? There's a couple of different workarounds for this. And I think last time I was talking to you, you were telling me that you do the splice method. Is that correct?
I do the needle nail knot. Is that what you're calling a splice method?
No, I was not calling that. No, the splice method was the one where you like insert
super glue.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I've done that one. That's just very smooth. The super glue splice is very, very smooth. It just fails a lot.
Right.
I don't have a lot of faith in it, so I really don't use it at all. But I know people that do.
Right.
They seem to have a lot of success. But I really like a good smooth needle nail knot where the leader goes inside the fly line and then gets poked out the side, and then you tie a nail knot around it.
Right.
We should stress that it needs to be well tied, and I don't see well tied ones very often.
That makes a lot of sense. That's a hard one to tie well.
I get people that message me and ask me about they'll say I've tried, you recommended a needle nail knot, I've tied that, but it's still hanging up in my guides, and I'll have them send me a picture of their needle nail knot and it looks like a pretzel. And you're like, well, yeah, it's got tag ends sticking out from 14 different angles, and it's like round like a ball. You're like, well, that's not really a needle nail knot, but okay. I'll send them a picture of a clean one. They'll go, oh, I see. Yeah, that would go through the guides much better. So you got to have a smooth connection there. However you do that, it's got to be smooth.
That was one of the hardest things, I think, when you first start with the Euro thing, is getting that connection smooth. It's just a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
The needle nail knot's hard, and then
it is.
Devin Olson has a micro loop that he makes with the fly line using a fly tying vise and a hook, which is what I'd use, and I love it. But if you don't know how to fly tie, or you don't have the stuff to fly tie, then you can't do it. And so it's just, and it's very impractical. It takes a second to get it right. And so that's the one kind of caveat to this whole setup, is that one connection does kind of get caught up in your guides unless you can solve it, or go to a fly shop and see if someone can do it for you, or do something like
hopefully
that.
Somebody can tie a nice, and you could do just a regular nail knot if it's really well tied. Again, we'll go through the guides pretty well. Super glue splice is a little easier than most of the others too, and actually if you can get it to hold, it works really, really well. It's super smooth. There are lots of ways to connect them. The key is, I'd argue most people, I've harshed on lots of things in these podcasts about casting and how people aren't any good at that. People are also really terrible at tying knots.
Right. Yeah.
How many times I gotta tell you? You gotta practice your knots, okay?
So if you're gonna learn to fly fish, you just might have to, when you're watching your next football or basketball or whatever, whatever sport you like to watch, or you're driving in a car for hours and you're not the one driving, don't do this while you're driving, but you're the passenger. grab a little monofilament, grab some hooks or just some swivels or something you can tie to, and just practice knots.
That's a big one. Very big one.
You got to get good at knots. Anyway, you got to have a clean connection there. I favor the needle nail. You have to have a braided core line to do that. If you have one other that we didn't talk about, if you have a mono core line, you can actually strip the coating off the line and then just blood knot your leader material right to the core of the mono core line. That works really well. Again, you got to trim those tags totally flush. Okay. And then one last comment or question I get a lot on line to leader connections is people ask me a lot, should I put resin or something over to smooth it out? And I would argue no, because it's adding more bulk and more weight. You just need to tie it really smooth to begin with and trim the tags totally flush, and then there's no need for resin.
Right.
Resin's just making it more bulky rather than helping.
I was just going to ask that question. I'm glad you prevented me from asking a very noob question about how can I do something not as good and just fix it with some resin?
Yeah, with some resin. If your knot's big, covering it with resin's making it bigger, right? So the resin's not helping, I don't think. I think you're better off without it. You just need to tie a really smooth knot to begin with.
Yeah, and it's adding mass, which is what you don't want to do.
Also bad.
Yeah.
You kind of touched a little bit about on fly line. So And one of the things I want to kind of go through is the mono versus braid thing. But let's just talk a little bit about a European style, or I don't even know what you would call it, a Euro fly line, right? A Euro
that's
fly
what
line.
I'd call it, a competition or Euro style fly line.
Okay, so what makes them so different from a regular fly line?
Diameter.
Okay.
They are incredibly thinner. So I read on Facebook forums and things all the time, people saying, "Oh, you don't need to buy one of those lines. Just take an old weight forward 5 and flip it around and use the thin end of the weight forward." And you're like, "Yeah, that's maybe better than the thicker end of the weight forward, but a 5-weight running line, or for that matter, a 2-weight running line, is significantly thicker than a Eurofly line."
Crazy.
So you're getting a lot more mass and a lot more diameter, thicker diameter by using the back end of another fly line. Euro fly lines are not that expensive, relatively speaking. In a day and age where high-end regular floating lines are $120, $130, a Euro line's like $50, right? So they're not... And they're usually level, so you can, when you wear out the first 10 feet of it, you just chop it off, and you got a whole new, brand new fly line right behind it. You haven't hardly used.
Right, and level. When you say level, you mean that they're not tapered. They don't gradually get thinner. They just stay completely the same diameter throughout the course of the line. Correct.
Most of them do. There are some that are tapered available as well, double tapers anyway. But
Right.
most of the Euro lines are just level.
Okay, and then so the next thing is this kind of monocore versus braided European fly line, Euro fly line. So what's kind of the difference between the two, and is there one that's better? Is there I know some people prefer one versus the other?
Yeah, I don't know that you can make a real argument about one significantly better than the other. They're different. Again, it's all about trade-offs. To me, the sell points, the pros for the monocore is that it's a tiny bit more sensitive. I don't really care about that too much. Sensitivity is overrated to me, but that is a perk of the monocore. Disadvantage of that is that it has more memory. Mono tends to hold more memory than a braided core that's softer and more supple. So especially in colder water conditions, a bit of maybe increased sensitivity you might be negated by having a line that has a little bit of coil to it. What else? The mono, because it's a little stiffer, maybe pushes through the guides a little bit better. It might shoot a little bit better. The disadvantage to another disadvantage to monocore is that you're pretty limited on connections to your leader. You either have to do a nail knot, or you have to do strip the coating and do a blood knot, or something like that that's really smooth from your line core to your leader. Because you can't go through the center of the monocore, you can't do a needle knot, you can't do a super glue splice, and on and on.
Right.
So it has a little more limitations. Most of those Euro lines, we should mention, are 0.022 of an inch diameter. You can get them down. I think Cortland makes one down to a 0.017, I think, is their thinnest.
Okay.
Competition legal, they have to be 0.22 or thicker. Most people don't care about that, but if you are going to get into the competition scene, know that they need to be 0.22 or thicker. Otherwise, mono and braid core, to me, I look at them as how you want to connect your leader. To some people, tying a blood knot's a lot easier than tying a nail knot. So if that's you, then you might favor the monocore. If you're looking for maybe the smoothest connection possible, a needle nail or a super glue splice, you probably want a braided core line.
Very thorough. Wouldn't you say, Mr. Ray Ray?
Well, yeah, and because I didn't know that there was a monocore Euro line.
There you go.
Noob in the room.
Euro noob.
Euro noob.
Is the Rio one mono?
The Rio is braid.
It is braid. That's what I thought.
Rio makes a braided core. Cortland makes braided and mono.
Right.
And SA currently makes a mono core.
Okay.
And then there's Airflows. There's a bunch of others that Airflow uses, like a GSP, a gel spun core.
Right.
That's a little different than both the others. But anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what's available right now. I'm sure that will change about the time that we make this podcast public.
Yeah, totally. All right, well, let's keep rolling then. Let's get on to the reel, because recently, and I'm sure this will change too, but recently there's just been a whole new segment of the market, which is the Euro reel. So Sage came out with their ESN reel. I've seen a Reddington one. And
Tilt.
The tilt, yes, the tilt. That thing is interesting looking.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of like a TV from the 1950s for some reason. I don't know why. Is it super heavy?
I'm doing pumping iron motions for those of you at home that can't see me.
Yeah, that's right.
The tilt. It has removable weight, so you can make it quite a bit lighter. But out of the box, it's really heavy.
That's hilarious.
It's got 3 big weight systems added to it.
Okay, so that was kind of what Sage came up with, and so let's talk about the reel. Is the reel a thing for Euro? Do you think it helps? Because the whole point, which we're going to talk about the rods and their length and everything, but the reel is supposed to balance the rod. I mean, that goes for any fly rod reel setup, right? But because the rods are so long, you kind of need a heavier reel to balance that. Is that correct?
That's the way I like to do it. There's arguments both ways. I hear people argue that, the disadvantage to having a reel that's heavy enough that it balances the rod is you still have to hold that weight up with your arm and your shoulder. For me, personally, I have some tendonitis issues in my arm, so my forearm, if I have a reel that's too light and the rod tip wants to drop on me all day and I have to physically hold the rod tip up instead of having the reel kind of counterbalance a lot of that weight for me, my shoulder bothers me a lot less than my forearm does personally. So I like to have the reel that's slightly either balanced perfectly or slightly overweighted to push the tip of the rod up and the butt of the rod down, if that makes sense.
Okay, fair.
But there are certainly people that argue that that's ridiculous and that you should just get the lightest reel possible.
When I first started doing the Euro thing, there wasn't a lot of information on this, and I went to actually Chicago Fly Outfitters, and the guy thought I was nuts because I was like, let me see that 8 weight, and I was putting it on this 3 weight. Right. I was like, this doesn't seem balanced. I need more weight, and he was like, really? I was like, dude, look, it's obviously tippy.
You have any 10-weight reels? This is a 2-weight rod. Do you have any 10s?
Yeah, exactly.
Spool it up with 400 yards of 30-pound backing for me.
It's hilarious. But so one of the things about the Euro reels is that they, from what I understand, I should say, is that they have like the connection between the spool and like the, what would you call that?
A full cage is what you're for.
Oh, yeah.
Because what ends up happening, especially if you kind of do what I was doing before, Lance was saying he doesn't like to do this, and I haven't brought it up until now, but for a while I was fishing without real fly line. I was just using this product made by OPST, which is called Lazar line, as instead of a fly line because it's so light and has no sag. I mean, it has sag, but minimal sag. So, but much like what Lance said, is I personally ended up getting annoyed with it, especially in the winter, because stripping it in when you have a fish is like super annoying. But the other annoyance that comes with this, which is supposed to be fixed by these Euro reels, is that because the line's so thin when it goes around the spool, it actually slips through the cracks and you end up getting like tangles at your rod, at your reel, I mean, because there's like lines slipping out like underneath the coiling.
Yeah, it could get between the frame and the spool. There's a gap when you put the frame and spool together. Sometimes the really thin leader or fly line could slip between those gaps if the tolerances aren't very tight on the reel that you're using.
Right. So that's supposed to be rectified from these Euro reels, correct or no?
Yeah, so the full cage reels that, again, gives and takes, they're more of a hassle to get the line, put the spool on and get the line threaded through there. But once it's threaded through that full cage, they can't escape it. Okay. I don't have any trouble with that at all. I hear lots of people do, so they like the full cage reels. Okay. The full cage reel is not going to hurt anything. To me, as long as you're out of the habit of pulling line off the reel while you're casting, like you pull off enough line so you're pulling it directly out and you're not pulling it into the corners of the frame. I never have the line really slip out on me, but I hear other people that do, and so they make full cage reels to compensate for that try and keep that line and leader in the frame.
Well, we even talked about that earlier, why you wouldn't want to strip line off a reel while you're casting anyway.
Yeah, we did.
True.
Yeah, I learned that. Yeah. I didn't realize that. That was a big lesson for me. Thanks, guys. You guys are the best.
Did you look at any of your reels? Have you started to rub the finish or groove them or anything yet?
I'm too scared to look. I don't want to know. It's like ignorance is bliss, Lance.
Your reels are too new for that.
Yeah, maybe they are.
Probably true.
My oldest one is 4 years old.
Yeah.
So
you're gonna keep on doing that for another 10 years.
Yeah, they're not too
old. And the reel thing, I mean, I don't think you have to have a Euro-specific reel. It's just like that to me is a luxury. No. You can use any reel you want. There is one reel that you do see in Europe quite a bit that you don't really see here, which is a semi-automatic reel, which is basically a reel with a little lever, and the lever, you pull it, and it has some sort of mechanism that spins all the line into itself. And I actually got one when I was in Spain taking those lessons. There's a machinist actually that started his own kind of like bespoke, artisan company that makes them called Ghost. They're really hard to get, but the one that I have is really nice and very, very well made. And I like it. I use it a lot. The only thing that I don't like about that reel, and from what I understand from other ones, I've only used this one, is just the drag system is kind of like whatever. It's like not really there. It's like you set it and you can't really tweak it. There's like a weird little thing that you use to tweak it. Then you have to take the spool off in order to change your drag. And
they're all spring operated too, aren't they?
I don't know. That's a Lance question.
No, these are not. You're thinking of like the old automatic reels, like from the U.S. They're spring loaded. These are more of like gear driven. Like you're pumping a little handle, so it's not. You're creating the movement out of the reel. They haven't really caught on here.
Like the inertia spins.
Gotcha.
They haven't caught on here, I think, for lots of reasons. One, they have lots of parts that are likely to fail. Two, none of the U.S. companies have really started making them. Three, they oftentimes don't have the best of drags. The other thing, when I've tried them, the line would wrap around the little lever every once in a while. That'd drive me nuts. But I see people that love them and use them. I know I have competitive friends that, from overseas that use them all the time and absolutely love them.
Yeah.
I haven't put them really into play in my fishing much. I know lots of people that have played with them, but not very many that are used to a regular reel that have stuck with them.
Yeah, it is very much a Euro thing. Like actually in Europe, they've become kind of household there. There's a bunch of different companies that make them there. JCM makes them, and then Betis makes them. There's a couple other ones, but they're all like in France and Spain, basically, from what I've seen.
Right.
So next time you go to Europe, you'll have to pick that one up.
Well, you're trashing my ideas of using my old reel that I found that's an automatic that's made in the USA for doing Euro-Nymphing. I was like, this would be cool.
Hey, it probably could work.
No.
I'm sure you can make it work.
All right, well, then let's keep going on. So the last thing we're left with here is the rod. The pole, remember? No. You can't say that.
I've been correcting people all through the shop lately. Oh, look at these poles on the wall. It's a rod.
Nice. Yeah, that's not a pole.
Yeah, they're just fishing poles. It doesn't matter.
Them long whippy sticks.
It's a fly fishing pole. It sounds so weird. It's amazing. Okay. So the rod. Yes. So what makes a good Euro rod? Tell me. Let's talk about this.
Length. So most Euro rods, as we talked earlier, are long. They're 10 foot, 10 and a half, even 11 feet in length. That allows you to have more reach. Allows you to handle a longer leader with greater ease. They are generally pretty soft in action. You're not really using the fly line to load the rod like you would with your 9'5" weight, for instance.
Okay.
When you're throwing dries with doesn't matter what weight, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, doesn't matter which weight, you're often loading the rod with the mass and the fly line. With a Euro setup, we're not going to have enough fly line to load the rod with the fly line, so the rod needs to be soft enough to kind of load under its own mass and bend quite a bit more under its own weight.
Okay.
So they're generally a little softer, and then they're also softer to help protect tippet. So they're softer for the casting purposes, and then also when you set the hook and are fighting fish on finer tippet, you need a soft rod that has a lot of give to it, that's very forgiving when you're fighting a fish and setting the hook, that has a lot of bend to absorb shock. So they tend to be long, lighter action, if you will. They're more medium action rods. A really good Euro rod, I would argue, is also very lightweight. You're going to hold it up all day long, so you don't want to have it super, super heavy.
Okay.
Personally, I tend mostly towards 10 footers because they're lighter. I sometimes fish 10 and a halves. I haven't really found a rod that I like that's longer than 10 and a half that I really, really like.
Right.
I've tried some 10/8s, some 10/9s, some 11 footers, some 11/2s. I've tried some long rods. I really haven't liked any of the really long rods. That's just me.
Okay.
I know other people that love an 11 footer, so I'm not telling you. If you have an 11 footer, you don't need to go immediately sell it. If you like it, then roll with it. It's good stuff.
Yeah, mine's a 10/8, and I like it, but I could see why I feel like sometimes it is actually too long. It's like a little inconvenient, gets snagged in trees and stuff like that. You really have to be watching quite carefully.
Right.
I've gotten very used to it, but it's
sure,
it's annoying sometimes.
It's always give and take, right? The longer rod gives you more reach, but it weighs more. It's less accurate. Yeah. It's harder to fish in tighter covers and tighter canopy, that kind of stuff. Anyway, it's give and take, right? The shorter, if you get a 10 footer or a 10 and a half, it's a little more accurate, it's a little lighter, but it doesn't give you as much reach, and on and on.
Also, one of the things that should be mentioned about the rod, which I learned the hard way, but then many people don't actually know this about the podcast, but I did the 2 pilots with George Daniel, who's a well-known angler, and on one of those podcasts, he kind of talked me through this thing, kind of with the rod situation, which is basically that there's a trade-off between a rugged rod and a light rod. The lighter it gets, the less robust it is. You have a higher chance of breaking. But the lighter it is, and the more easy it is to fish through long hours of fishing. So I learned this the hard way. I say that because I have a very long, super light, very sensitive rod that I keep breaking. So it comes at a cost, and I don't even know if it's worth the cost. I won't mention the manufacturer, and they're not from the United States, but it's just one of these things where it's something that you should think about. If you're going to be someone who's like bushwhacking through the Sierras and you're getting to far off reaches and hiking and stuff like that, you probably don't want to get a rod that's like super light and like easily broken. If you are someone that, is just always going to fish in the same place and there's plenty of casting room and it's like there's not much to get in the way of your fishing, then maybe you can get away with it. I don't know what you think about that, Lance. I'd love to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, I think it's hard to say that a light rod isn't necessarily durable. I mean, obviously, if you have more carbon fiber there, thicker walls, it's going to be more durable. But most fly rods are all pretty thin-walled these days anyway. I think some of that's going to come down to the taper design and the resin system they're using and the care that's probably, I don't know a lot about rod building, I'm not an expert on it. I guess I know a little bit about it, but I think, lightweight. I mean, we get people in the shop all the time saying, should I get a 2-weight or should I get a 4 or should I get a 3? What should I get for Euro? To me, I always say, the 3 is kind of the happy medium, the 2's for lighter applications, the 4's for heavier applications. You can use a little bit heavier tippet with a 4 than you could a 3 or a 2. You could maybe turn a slightly larger fish, but it's heavier, it's less forgiving. It's going to wear you out a little more. In the case of the 4, there's all gives and takes. I think it's interesting. You use the term sensitivity a lot, and I think I've brought up before that I'm an outsider here maybe, but I don't worry too much about sensitivity in a Euro rod because I'm relying on the sighter to tell me what's going on more than feel.
That makes sense.
I feel like anytime you're just waiting to feel the strike, you're going to be late. We've covered that a little bit. Yeah. And the other thing that I think is funny about sensitivity is most people I think are really confused about what makes a rod sensitive. Like I get customers in all the time that say, I want a Euro rod that's really sensitive, and you hand them a couple different models, one that's a little stiffer action and one that's really soft, and in their mind the soft action is more sensitive, which is completely wrong. Okay. If you go look at spinning and casting rods that are designed for sensitivity, like bass specifically, bass or walleye type rods, and you look at like their spinning, their jigging rods or a flipping stick or something like that where you're relying 100% on sensitivity, they're broomsticks, right? They're really, really stiff. Now there are other factors that can play in here, the carbon fiber and the resins and things, the type of handle and all. There's all kinds of things that can go into sensitivity. But if we're just using the action of the rod, like stiffer versus softer, what most people think is a more sensitive rod, being a softer rod, is actually less sensitive because the rod absorbs what you would normally feel. If a rod doesn't bend at all, it actually transmits feel better than a rod that bends on the slightest little touch.
Okay, that makes sense.
So it's interesting to hear somebody, people, and I'm not saying that's you're relating to here, but you reminded me by using that term sensitivity. People say all the time, I want to get a 2 because it's going to be more sensitive, and you're like, I don't think that's how that works. The 4, like a 10-foot 4-weight that's stout as can be, might actually be way more sensitive than a 2-weight, just because of its makeup and it doesn't bend and give as much. If that rod bends, you're absorbing that strike instead of feeling that strike.
That makes a lot of sense. The rod that I have is supposed to be kind of a faster action rod,
so it's probably very sensitive.
Many times I've actually used my 9-foot 4-weight, which is a fast action rod also, and I actually loved Euro-Nymphing on that thing, and I think probably because of what you're saying. Although it's not like I'm like waiting for the feel, but for whatever reason, it just feels like I'm very connected to the flies, But maybe, I'm a noob, so maybe I'm just totally
I don't
rough.
think there's a disadvantage to that. Like you're not, I guess, if you're relying 100% on feel, it's a disadvantage. But if you're watching the sighter properly and you can feel, there's no harm in feeling what's going on, right? To me, it's a little oversold, the sensitivity part of it, because I don't think that it's that, I guess I feel like I can see a strike in a sighter long before I can feel it.
All right, well, let's keep moving here. There's a couple features that come with these rods that are sort of completely unique to a Euro rod. The first one, which has been missing on a lot of rods for a while, but it feels like now they're starting to get in on it, is that guide that's been lowered so that you don't have sag between the reel and your first guide. So that's something that if you're looking for a Euro rod and you're considering getting one, that's something that's probably not a bad addition because it's taking out, a lot of times you'll see people Euro-nymphing and like the fly line from their reel to the first guide on their rod, you'll see this huge like kind of belly right there.
Sag.
That's the old, the evil devil sag. So that's rectified with first guide that's closer to the reel. Is that correct?
That's a more common feature on newer Euro rods, I would argue.
Right.
It's closer than that bottom stripping guide is closer to the handle for sure than most traditional fly rods.
Okay, cool.
To me, I find if they get it too close, it cuts down on your ability to shoot line. It's not gathering as much. It doesn't shoot as well, but it does eliminate sag. Somewhere in there's a happy medium, right? If it's too far away, you've got a lot of sag, but it shoots really well. If it's too close, it doesn't shoot so well, but there's a lot less sag.
Okay. Good to know. That's interesting.
Definitely a feature of a Euro rod, though. Lowers first stripping guide.
And then the other thing that, people had been mentioning this from the first Euro rods that were coming out. Keep in mind, people, like these rods have been out, kind of in the last 5 years, I want to say, maybe longer.
Some of them, yeah. I mean, there were rods being made for Euro stuff that are much, much older than that.
Okay, I didn't realize that.
They've really caught on in the U.S. market in the last even 10 years, let's say, right?
Okay.
Before that, if you go back 15 or 20 years, we were using a lot more 10-foot 4-weights and just whatever we could find that was long and light, as long and light as possible.
I see. Okay. Well, one of the things that they've incorporated that's like a feature is the reverse reel seat, right? That's
the down locking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So maybe explain how that works a little bit and if you think it's necessary or not.
I don't think it's necessary. It's interesting to talking to some of the manufacturers about them that some of them are of the opinion that it's better to actually have an up-locking seat for balance purposes and so on. The idea of I guess I was one of the people that started pushing for them because we wanted the weight to be further down, the reel to be further down to kind of counterbalance the length of the rod. Mm-hmm. And then the more you move that reel down to the butt, rather than having the reel, the threads of the locking mechanism on the reel seat pushing the reel up into the cork, the less you have hanging out behind the reel, the less your line will wrap around it.
That makes sense.
So there's kind of two things in there. One is a down locking reel seat is a common feature on Euro rods, right?
Yeah.
It's funny, down locking reel seats, like when I very first started fly fishing, they were still pretty common in some of the cheaper rods, and a lot of the higher end rods were starting to come with up locking instead of down locking. Mm-hmm. And then the industry went to where they basically did everything up locking for a long time. And the first couple of companies that I worked with to try and make Euro rods, I would beg them to do down locking, and they would just say, we don't do down lockings like 1970s,
right?
80s, early 80s rods. We don't do that anymore. And I'm like, I understand. Like, I'm not asking you to do it on your flagship fast action Western type model, but on a Euro rod, we want it down locking. Like, no, we don't. We won't. That won't sell. We'll never do that. Okay, well, version 1 doesn't have that. Version 2 or 3 down the road, they almost all come with down locking seats.
Crazy.
So changing the balance point is the thing you're accomplishing there, and then also, for me, eliminating the tag end, the little butt end that sticks out behind the reel that the line can wrap around.
Right, and that happens to me often.
And then then some of the manufacturers add a fighting butt to the end of their rods, which personally I despise.
Right.
I hate those things.
Yeah, but what about those giants you're landing, dude?
Well, it's not so much that. It's just I hear the argument is people hold the rod up and they want to tuck that little fighting butt into their forearm to help balance the rod and use less arm and wrist, hand and wrist, I should say, strength to hold the rod up all day. And that's probably a valid point, but if you're fishing a light rod, it's not necessary. And that little fighting butt just makes the line wrap around it constantly. I still fish some rods with the fighting butt because I really like the rods, but I really despise that particular feature personally. Other people you talk to love that feature, right? It's all about preference.
Yeah, I put that fighting butt like right on my belly button when I'm landing, like that whale, 8-inch brook char.
8-inch whale.
Fighting that tarpon.
Like how I did that, though?
Brook char.
Yeah.
Brook char, I got it.
Fist bump on me. Yeah. That's a Lance Eganism. A Leganism.
Funny side story here. We were going to go, we being Fly Fish Food, Curtis and I and Brigham were going to a high alpine lake last week. And on the drive up, we had a fairly lengthy drive. We decided that we were going to where we were going to catch brookies all day. Mm-hmm. We decided that all day in every segment, we were going to call them brook char the whole way through the video just for fun.
That's awesome.
This is a beautiful brook char. Check out this brook char. Oh, look at that one. That brook char ate my dry fly. I caught that brook char on a silver lancer or whatever, right? On a balanced leech. We were going to brook char it up all day long. And then I ended up landing one fish and I hooked and lost a second. Nobody else caught a fish. So we didn't get a lot of opportunities for brook char.
That's hilarious.
You're going to be confusing people.
Next time.
You're going to be like, what's this new species of fish everybody's going after? Brook char? I need to catch this now.
Yeah.
It's like, nah, it's a brook char.
For those that are wondering, brookies are a salmonid, but they are not technically a trout. They are a char.
So that's a Leganism.
That and nylon versus fluoro.
Both monofilaments.
So I guess the last thing that we should do, we've kind of, we've covered basically from fly to leader to fly line to reel to rod, and we've kind of talked a bit about, how to set up for this thing. A lot of the knots and stuff like that, we're going to be doing in like these separate things. If you haven't already heard them, I'm sure you probably already have, but we're going to have something that's basically like a quick and dirty, which will be kind of a walkthrough of the knot, probably a video, because you can't actually describe it that well via podcast. So
right.
If you haven't already looked at those, that's what those are. Those quick and dirties are teaching you things that don't translate very well via spoken word.
Loop it around 3 times, twist it, and do the hokey pokey.
But so we've gotten you this far, and now I guess we should just kind of walk through, let's just walk through this Euro style thing, like as if we were on a river. It's like you walk up to a piece of water, looks good. What kind of water do we want to fish? I know it's kind of good for so many different types of water. That's why it's so deadly. Part of the reason it's deadly. But maybe you can pick one that's like good for a beginner and just kind of walk us through how you would cast your way through this thing. I know the casting is also totally different, and the videos that we keep mentioning, they go through at length on the casting, but maybe you can just kind of point out a little bit about what makes it so different and how we need to adapt our cast to get these beads where they need to be.
Okay, yeah, so casting is tough to describe. I would again highly suggest the videos, modern nymphing videos for that, but the cast I like to recommend, and this is going to be subjective to my preferences, I suppose, but I like to do what a lot of people refer to as a Belgian style cast, where you take flies under the rod on the back cast and over the rod on the forward cast, where on a regular fly cast, you would take flies over the rod, both forward and back.
Right.
Some people also call it a tension cast because you have tension all the way through. So you're lifting the flies off the water in front of you. They're traveling kind of to the side of you, but underneath the rod, going back. They're under tension all the way around, and then as you go forward, only do they go over the top of the rod. Then it's most important to finish with the rod high so that nothing touches the water but the flies and the tippet. So the ideal Euro cast makes it so that your fly line, your leader, and your sider never touch the water. All that hits the water is flies and tippet, and then the leader and sider are up above the water, ready to indicate a strike, ready to tell you if you're touching bottom, and allowing the flies to descend all the way through. Versus what I see most people do is finish with the rod too low so the line and leader hit the water. The flies hit the water, they start to descend, and then in an effort to see the leader and sider and track it, they lift the whole rig back up, and the flies halfway through their descent get ripped back up in the water column and have to start over again. The one, you're disturbing the water twice as much. 2, you're cutting out the fastest possible descent of the flies by having them drop and lift. So again, the ideal setup is making the forward cast, finishing with the rod high, so the line and leader never touch the water. Not even the sider touches the water, only tippet and flies.
Right, yeah, that's probably I would say the biggest mistake in the noob cast, and it's a very hard habit to break for a lot of people.
Very hard to break. When I guide, I tease a lot of my clients at the beginning of each day. I talk them through this. I said, I want you to keep the sider off the water all day, and then I tell them all, when I'm driving home today, I'm going to call my wife and say, hey, I'm heading home, I'm safe. She'll go, how was your day? And I'll say, my day was good. She'll go, did you have to say keep the sider off the water 8,000 times or only 1,000 times? Because she knows that's going to change my mood the rest of the day.
Yeah.
And it's very rarely less than, I don't count them, I'm teasing, but it's very rarely a low number of times. It's amazing how often at the beginning of the day and 8 hours later, how I have to still tell them on every cast, get the sider up. Remember at 8 a.m. I told you get the sider up, it's 4 p.m. and we're still not getting the sider up off the water.
Nothing has changed.
Right.
In defense of the noobs, it's just a hard thing to remember to do because there's so much going on, It took me a long time to get that one, but once you start doing it and you actually like everything feels and works so much better because it's like your beads are sinking way faster than they ever could have because there's not a bunch of tippet lying on the water surface slowing them down. And you're like instantly connected. The other advantage to doing that is that a lot of times, like in the summertime when there's like fish that are feeding on top and stuff, you could get hit right as those beads hit the water.
A lot. Yeah. That happens a lot. And it doesn't happen a lot if you're not in contact.
Exactly. But you'll never know if you're dropping your rod tip. So that's a really big one. It's probably like the biggest thing, at least when I've been teaching like the people I've taken out to do Euro-Nymphing, that's like the number one thing I tell them is like just make sure you stop your rod tip super high and let that stuff hit the water and then track. But it is a kind of like there's a lot of steps there. So,
and like you say, it's a good thing to, in defense of all anglers that aren't doing that well, it is also very different if you come from indicator nymphing or just dry fly fishing. Your tendency is to make the cast and drop the rod, right?
Yeah.
So your muscle memory is already built in to do something different. With the new technique, though, you just got to get in your mind that you're doing this Euro setup and you got to do it a little different. It's got to finish high. But I'm with you. In their defense, it's a very normal thing in most fly fishing techniques to drop the rod.
Yeah, it's just kind of like, ingrained in all of us.
For sure.
The regular fishing, if you will. But anyways, yeah, so that's the casting. And then as far as like, pieces of water to fish, it kind of, runs the gamut. Maybe like the hardest place to fish, and maybe you disagree with me, but I would say is like really slow water, where then you kind of have to switch to a dry dropper, or you could put an indicator on if you're not doing any competitions or something. But that's kind of like where the most challenging gets in. And I'm curious to see what you think of why, because sometimes I force myself to actually fish 2 beads, no indicator, just straight leader in really slow deep water, just because I think it really accentuates when my hands are like shaking and I can see like the rod tip bouncing. I do it as an etude, almost as like a training thing. Like, is that why you would say it's more challenging water, just because it's like there's not current helping you drift the flies?
Yeah, I do think that. I think that's one of those situations, slow, deep water, long, deep pool, where an indicator is better a lot of times because it will actually suspend stuff at a particular depth and keep it there.
Right.
The Euro system is really good for more really pinpoint, accurate, shorter drift type casts, right?
Right.
So when you can hook up an indicator rig where you can keep flies at a specific depth just off the bottom, hopefully in a long, deep run or a glide or whatever, long, deep pool, and you can fish it a lot farther away, it has an advantage for sure versus the Euro setups. Kind of, we call it in one of our videos the fishing, I call it the elongated U, right? You're fishing
the hammock, you called it also.
Devin calls it the hammock.
Oh.
Yeah, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Now we called it both those in our video, but the flies hit the water and they start to descend, so that's kind of the top end of the hammock or that curve. That elongated U, and they go in and then they reach their deepest point, and then as they travel past you, they usually start swinging back up. So you kind of have a limited range that you can really effectively Euro nymph. And if the pool is just 50, 60 yards long, or even 50 feet long for that matter, and you're trying to get flies in, the flies with the Euro setup just want to constantly sink, right? Can you just get vertical and hold them? Yes, you can, but you hold them underneath the side or vertically means you have to be really, really close to them.
Yeah.
And in a lot of slow, especially slow water situations, the fish won't allow you to get that close to them.
Right.
So like all techniques, it has its limitations, and that's definitely one of them.
I've found for me, it's a good place to kind of like show myself how bad my angle is and where I'm keeping my rod tip and stuff. Obviously that changes depending on the water depth and stuff, but I've been using it kind of like to show myself like, okay, how still can I actually be? And it's been pretty good for that. But I normally, if I'm like trying to actually catch fish, I would never fish it like that. That's where you put something on your leader. A
great place for an indicator rig, great place for a dry and a dropper, or dry and 2 droppers if law's allowed. Also a really great place in that water type for a jig streamer.
Okay, great.
On the Euro rig.
If I could ask, we talked about casting, presentation-wise, typically downstream, across stream.
That's a great question.
That's a good question. Yeah, good point, Ray. Upstream or up and across is most common, right? I like to always say I favor my position in the stream and upstream of me. In really deep water, occasionally you hook some fish downstream of my position, but I like to have most of my fish hooked upstream of me. It's a better hooking position. It's a better fish fighting position, and so on. If you have to, just to get to depth fishing below you, it's better to hook one and maybe lose a higher percentage of them than you would if you're fishing upstream than to not hook any, right? But ideally, if you can, I would suggest fishing up or up and across. Or up and across. I think up and across is the easiest. Straight upstream is very effective. It's harder for most people to do. It's harder to cast, harder to control.
Yeah, it's hard to keep your flies in the same spot as they come to you. Right.
Yeah, it is that. But straight upstream certainly works. It's easier to do just slightly upstream or upstream and slightly across to quite a way upstream and quite a ways across. Both work really well.
And you guys have a really interesting way of retrieving the line too. It's not just a strip. You have I've seen a lot of guys do the hand twist. It makes my brain go, what?
I don't do that very much, but Devin does.
All right.
Devin likes to do the hand twist retrieve. I do it a little bit. I do it a lot in lakes, stillwater fishing. I do a lot of hand twisting. I tend to make a cast and just do a long strip, let go, and do another long strip if I need to take up slack.
Gotcha.
But either one works. There's no right or wrong there. It's just a matter of taking up slack. You can do hand twist retrieve. You can do long one single strip. You just need to be able to take up slack for sure.
Without bouncing your rod tip.
That's the hardest.
That's the key. And we talk about that in our videos too. But the key there is making sure that you're moving your non-rod hand to your rod hand, because the tendency is you make a cast and then what you end up wanting to do is move your rod hand to your non-rod hand, and then you're changing the angle that you're leading the flies and that you're staying in contact. When what needs to happen is your rod hand is controlling the drift, and your non-rod hand is going to the rod hand to take up slack and retrieve flies or retrieve line, I should say.
Okay, and you kind of touched upon it just now, but just really quick. So let's just walk them through. We've gotten a piece of water that looks kind of juicy. We know there's fish there. You're going to cast maybe up and across, right?
Okay.
And you're going to stop with your rod tip high. The beads will hit the water and start to sink, and then you're instantly tracking them. One of the things that I think is important, and maybe you can comment on this, is kind of the angle at which your rod tip is in relation to the beads. Like, should it be upstream, downstream of where the flies are?
Yeah, ideally the rod tip is downstream or down and across from the flies.
Right.
It's it varies a lot depending on the situation, but it's not very rarely going to be upstream. It could be slightly upstream. We do a little bit of Pat Weiss, our buddy Pat, kind of coined this term. I think he calls it sliding flies along the bottom, where he gets really vertical at first, let the flies almost fall underneath the leader and sider, and then you almost have fishing flies that are heavy enough that they're sliding along the bottom, or at least your point flies sliding along the bottom, and you're almost helping them along. So you end up with your rod tip a little bit upstream of the flies sometimes, but most of the time the rod tip would be downstream of the flies.
Okay, cool. And then, so we have the rod tip downstream from the flies, and we are slowly tracking. And then this is where it kind of gets to that clutch thing where it's like so specific to Euro really is, how do you know when you get a take?
Right.
Most people think that they're going to like feel something, but like we mentioned earlier, if you felt it, then you waited too long. You should have set the hook earlier.
Right.
Okay, so maybe you can talk a little bit about reading the sider.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, you're moving the rod downstream of the rig just slightly, right? You're staying in contact. That doesn't mean that you're totally tight. You don't have a totally straight line. If you're totally tight, you probably have too much weight on, right?
Right.
You have a fly that's dragging bottom.
Or you're pulling it towards you.
Or you're pulling it too fast.
Yeah.
So you have a little bit of sag, but not too much. Just a tiny bow in the leader that you're staying just ahead of the rig enough that you have contact, but not so much that you're pulling the rig faster or the flies faster than the current you're trying to fish. So it's kind of a learned, it changes throughout the day and every run's different, but you're just leading those flies just enough to barely stay in contact, right?
Right. And then when you get a strike, what happens?
Then you're setting the hook low and downstream.
But like, how do you know? I'm saying.
How do you register the strike?
Yes.
I like to say you're watching for that sider to do anything unnatural to the current. So again, I keep talking about our videos, but there's whole segments in our videos about this. But you're watching for that sider to hesitate, to stop, to move sideways, to get pushed down towards the water surface. Any movement that you didn't put in with your hand and the rod that you're controlling is either your fly's ticking bottom or a fish taking your fly. So when you're new, like we say, the sets are free, right? Set it, don't regret it. Better set than sorry. We have all kinds of cliches for setting the hook. I tell my clients beginning every day, do not hesitate to set the hook. You will be the first client I've ever had in years of, hundreds of anglers that I have to say, you know what, Pablo, you're just setting the hook too often. I need you to cut back on your hook sets. I've never even come close to that. All day long, this is the other one my wife asked me about. Did I have to say keep the sider off the water more or less than 10,000 times? Did I have to say set the hook more or less than 10,000 times?
Well, I said set the hook. You set the hook, okay?
Don't get Lance as a guide, because all he's going to do is talk crap about you when you leave.
Not you personally, just not everybody does it, just 99% of them.
I'm kidding. If you get Lance as a guide, you are lucky. That's all I'm saying.
We're civil, we're personable, but
Yeah.
I'm trying to teach them things, and so I have to kind of keep hammering the same principles home, right? So you got to set the hooks. You got to look for opportunities to set the hook. When you're brand new at it, you're going to be setting the hook all the time, right? You're just going to have to do it to figure out what is and what isn't a fish. Because if you hesitate, you're going to find that there are a lot of fish you're missing. Once you start setting the hook on everything, and then you'll start realizing, okay, I saw what my sighter did there. I saw that. I felt this. That was just the bottom. And before long, you kind of build up a little bit more muscle memory and just ability to decipher that was the bottom versus this is a fish. Now, you're never going to have that 100% right. So again, I would say when in doubt, set the hook.
Yeah, even if it's like a sixth sense feeling where you're like, oh, that could be something, just do it. A lot of times, actually, I think as you get better, you start to get those things in a weird way. It's like,
and you will definitely get that. When people get in the zone when they're fishing, I've had Team USA members before that were watching in practices, we're watching each other fish, and I've had friends fish alongside me before and say, I saw you set the hook, I saw there's a fish there, I don't know why you set the hook, I didn't see anything. And you just sometimes get in that mode where you're just dialed in, you got the sixth sense, and you just know there's something there, you set the hook.
Yeah.
You just got to look for opportunities to set, for sure. Do not hesitate. There will be fish on there a lot more often than you think.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things also going along with the hook set thing is, and they talk about this in the videos also, is you've cast the flies upstream and they've come past you with the current, then you have to recast. And when you do that, you actually start by doing a hook set. And a lot of times there'll be a fish on there. That's happened to me a bunch of times also.
Absolutely. Yeah, your hook set becomes your back cast, and it's a good way to just check the flies, because there can be a fish that's on your fly right at the very end of the drift, right when you kind of gave up on it, and you give it a hook set, that's your back cast, and if there's a fish there, you got that fish on. If not, you're right into your next cast.
That's right. So that was pretty thorough. I think we did a good job. There's a bunch of other stuff that we can talk about, but there's just not enough time, and eventually we'll do it again. And not only that, I'm sure that many people will go get your videos and they will actually be able to see this in real time.
We've been I cut you off. We've been plugging them a lot, but it is, we can talk about it till we're blue in the face, right? Being able to see it visually in the video is a big help.
Yeah, and that's actually what I was going to say is one pro tip that I didn't do for the first 2 years that I had the videos or something. I was watching them on my phone every night, like when I would go to bed. And my wife used to be like, "What are you doing? Oh my gosh, that thing again? Oh my gosh!" She got so annoyed with me. I watched this video at least 30 times each.
Loser.
Yeah, I'm a loser. #. One of the things that I did not do was watch it on my TV. So recently, just before we started doing the podcast, I was like, I want to watch these again. I'm sure there's so much more to learn from them. And I started watching them on my 4K TV. And it's crazy the difference, because you can actually see where the sighter is. So if you watch it on your phone, he'll be describing what's happening, but you can't actually see where the sighter is. But once you start to see where the sighter is, you're like, oh, that's where he cast it. Oh, that's where he's drifting. And it really kind of helps you read water, helps you realize what a good tracking, a good drift looks like. There's a bunch of advantages to it. So my pro tip is watch it on your TV also.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a good thing to say. It's, bigger screen, you get a little more detail, especially if you have a 4K or something. They're filmed in high definition, so you'll see a lot there.
Yeah, it's really well done. The whole thing's really well done. My only complaint about it, if I can be totally frank, is that I wish I was the composer.
Don't be frank, be candid.
Well, I'm going to be totally candid. You guys should have picked me as the composer, but aside from that, they're gloriously made.
Maybe if we do a next one, you're gonna have to be our composer. See, you've just created a job for yourself.
All right, yeah, that was my plan. That was definitely my plan.
Now you're being frank.
Now I'm being frank. All right, well, anyways, that's gonna wrap it up for this one. Thank you so much for listening and tuning into this. Surely the Euro podcast is gonna be a popular one, and we're really lucky to have Lance on the Euro podcast. We've had a good time with this one, and we'll be waiting for you guys on the next podcast. Thanks a lot to Ray here too.
Woo-woo.
Yeah, word up
Thanks,
on the
Ray.
Word up. I don't know what I did, but I did something.
Oh yeah, you had great questions, dude.
Good points that we always forget. That you're always on point for us.
I'm here to be your point fly.
Exactly.
It's better than a dropper, I guess.
Yeah.
That was actually pretty good.
Zing.
That's going to be my new favorite. All right. Well, thanks a lot to you too, Lance.
Yeah.
And we'll be back on the next one, guys.
Thanks, everyone, for listening.
The new, the knower. Peace out.
This was a Raul Maria production.
Sorry, that was a pretty weak ending on my part, y'all.